All right, let's try to get started here. Good morning. Welcome to AEI, and welcome to our program today, The Value of Our Veterans, a conversation with Representatives Mike Levin and Brad Wenstrup. I'm Gary Schmidt. I'm a senior scholar here in strategic studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm director of AEI's program on American citizenship. I'm going to skip a lengthy set of introductions since we're trying to pack in quite a bit in the next 2 hours, less than 2 hours. So for those joining us here and or online or watching on C-SPAN, if you want lengthier bios, please go to AEI's website and go to the link for the events page, and you'll see everybody's biographies. So let me begin by just giving a quick overview of the proceedings today. We will first hear from Representative Mike Levin, the recently elected congressman from California's 49th district, a district that runs along from northern San Diego to southern Orange County. And quite frankly, having a niece who lives out there, I'm not sure why the congressman decided to move to DC, but nevertheless, it's a patriotic act on his part. Congressman Levin is the chair of the subcommittee on economic opportunity of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. Following his remarks, we'll hear from former Veterans Affairs Committee member, Representative Brad Wenstrup. The congressman represents the Ohio 2nd District, which runs from the outskirts and parts of Cincinnati to parts east. We're really pleased that the congressman can join us again here at AEI. We always appreciate his willingness to come our way. After their opening remarks, the congressman will be joined in a discussion by moderator and veteran Military Times reporter Leo Shane. Leo will then, after the brief remarks by the two congressmen, then we'll have a brief question and answer session with our guest here. After that discussion, we will then switch to a panel discussion with Cynthia Gilman of the Henry Jackson Foundation for Military Medicine, Mike Hutchings of Combined Arms, Rory Riley Topping of Riley Topping Consulting, and my colleague Rebecca Burgess from AEI. The focus of that discussion will be, what do we need to do to change the broken veteran narrative to the more accurate narrative of veterans as social assets? The panel discussion will also be followed by a Q&A session, and the morning's event will end promptly at 10 a.m. Just two housekeeping notes. After our discussion with the members, if you'd stay in your seats for a few minutes while we transition to the second panel, we would greatly appreciate it. And second, for both Q&A sessions, if you would please wait for a mic, and as always, introduce yourself, and as not always, please do ask a question. Now, just let me conclude by noting that Veterans Affairs and veteran policies is a subject which AEI scholars such as Sally Sattel, Giselle Donnelly, Rebecca, and I have been writing about for some time. But writing about policy is one thing. Actually producing legislation, improving veterans' lives, is quite another. Which is why we're especially delighted to have Chairman Levin and Congressman Wenstrup with us today. They are the bipartisan co-sponsors of the Veterans Education, Transition, and Opportunity Prioritization Plan, also known as VET-OP Act of 2019, a measure that passed in the House in late May. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Mike Levin and Brad Wenstrup.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're not voting today, as you know, so I'm grateful to have a somewhat free day before I get on the plane. And no better way to begin that day than to talk about the most rewarding aspect of my service so far in Washington, D.C., which has been the ability to chair a subcommittee on the House Veterans Affairs Committee dealing with housing, homelessness, workforce development, transition assistance. It is an incredible opportunity, particularly for a freshman, one that I take seriously every day, and I'm honored to have that chance. I'm grateful also to my colleagues across the aisle The House Veterans Affairs Committee is perhaps the most bipartisan place in Congress. There are a lot of interesting stories going around Washington right now. It's been a crazy week, as everybody knows. But the story that isn't told nearly often enough is the story of bipartisanship that still happens on a daily basis in Washington. And our work in HVAC is, I think, the best representation of that. I often say that most of the time, if you were to turn off the video and just listen to the audio in our hearings, and in our subcommittee in particular, you wouldn't know who the Republicans were, you wouldn't know who the Democrats were. We're all there in the service of our veterans, in the service of our country. And I hope that's how it always is on House Veterans Affairs. I can tell you that I think both Chairman Mark Takano and Ranking Member Dr. Phil Rowe are doing a terrific job. Just the same in my subcommittee, I'm honored to have Gus Bilirakis of Florida as the ranking member, and we have built a relationship of respect and appreciation for one another, built on our shared trust and the deep desire that we both have to serve our veterans. So I'm the grandson of a World War II veteran. My grandfather on my dad's side, Ted Levin, and I think of him all the time when thinking about how we treat those who, in many cases, sacrificed everything for our freedom and our security. And he taught me a lot about what it means to be a patriot, what it means to serve your country. So while I did not serve in the military, nonetheless, I have this small opportunity as the chairman of the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee to try to give back to those who've given so much. And my grandpa would often talk about the gaps in the VA or in services provided to veterans. I remember that well, and for me it is absolutely unconscionable that we would not do everything possible to treat our veterans as the heroes that they are. That includes the best health care, housing opportunities, workforce development opportunities, the best transition assistance program that we can possibly come up with, and so much more. So the other good news is that we're actually passing bills. You don't often hear about that in the press either, but in our HVAC committee, I think we've considered something like 40 bills. We've passed, over half of them, and I think roughly about 10 of them, and I know there's at least a couple of the HVAC staff here, I think roughly 10 of them came from my subcommittee along with Gus Bilirakis. And I'm honored that 6 of the bills that I helped to introduce, each with a Republican, has passed the House of Representatives. I'm also encouraged that I just had a great meeting with Senator John Tester a couple days ago, and I'm encouraged that I think a lot of these can get over the finish line in the Senate as well, particularly at a time when we may doubt that much legislation coming from the House is actually going to get floor time and pass the Senate. I think some of these initiatives actually will become law, which is really exciting. So if you'll entertain me, I would just very briefly like to explain these 6 bills. One of them is with Representative Wenstrup, and I'm very grateful for your leading the way with the VetOp Act. And what it would do is create a 4th administration at the VA. It's a somewhat controversial plan with the VA, but everybody else wants it. All the VSOs want it. All the veterans I talked to want it. Because what would happen is you would be able to separate the core work for economic opportunity from the benefits administration. The vast majority of staffing and resources at the benefits administration are directed towards things like disability compensation and pension claims, but there has been a lack of oversight and accountability towards the distribution of other benefits, such as the Forever GI Bill, VOC Rehab, home loan benefits, and the VA's portion of the Transition Assistance Program. It's outdated, the structure that's there now, and it's undermining the benefits that our veterans have rightly earned. And so what we'd have to do is restructure existing resources. It would actually eliminate red tape rather than create more red tape. And again, everybody that I speak with, the actual veterans that will be impacted, very much want this to happen. And I would say Mr. Wenstrup would agree with me on that. And hopefully the VA will come around. It might make things a little bit more difficult for certain people at the VA in the short term, but the long-term impact and the gains that our veterans will experience as a result of this restructuring, I think will be very welcome over time. Also wanted to mention some of these other bills. So we have one to support disabled veterans housing. That's a bill that we did with Gus Bilirakis, specially adapted housing. It just passed. That's one where I think we have a great shot of getting it through because there's a Senate companion bill. We want to improve the TAP program. My friend Jody Arrington has been a champion of this, and he had a friend, Bill Mulder, who passed away after service in Iraq. Mr. Arrington is confident that had his friend had better transition assistance, perhaps more off-base transition assistance, more of a wraparound of a support system, that his friend may have had the opportunity to go on and have a more successful post-service career. We have another one on mental health access. There is a bill that we're doing to expand the access to the VA vet centers to others, such as those who served in the National Guard or the Reserves, but still saw a significant amount of combat, where clearly the VA vet centers ought to be available to them as well. And then we're trying to also protect our veterans when they go to take out a VA loan. I have a bill with Andy Barr that would help fix that. Another on STEM scholarships that would make the requirements under the Forever GI Bill for a STEM scholarship actually commensurate with what most programs are offering. So a lot of these are hopefully going to be non-controversial, even in today's Washington. You never know for sure. You all might know better than I. I've only been here for 7 months. But what I've seen is that all the partisanship, all of the rhetoric seems to be set aside in service of our veterans. And it should be that way. I hope it's always that way. I can tell you that I have no greater honor than being on the HVAC committee. By background, I'm an environmental attorney, so I'm very interested in energy and environmental policy, and I've dug deep into those areas. What I didn't expect is that my service on the House Veterans Affairs Committee would be as rewarding as it is, and that the early accomplishments that I would be able to achieve here in Washington would be in the Veterans Affairs Committee with these 6 bipartisan bills that we passed in the last 7 months. So in the spirit of bipartisanship, you're going to hear from Representative Wenstrup. Look forward to answering your questions, continuing to get your ideas on how we can best serve our veterans. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Again, thank you all for being here this morning. It is a pleasure to be with you, especially to talk about this particular topic. Mike, you're exactly right when you talk about the VA committee. And I would also share this. The VA committee is probably the top committee when it comes to bipartisanship, but a lot of it exists on the other committees as well, just not always at the end of the day. And I had a reporter at home one time say something about that, and I said, well, how many members of Congress can you name? And it was only about 10. And it was pretty much the names of the people that you see every evening on cable TV. And I said, what do you think the rest of us are doing all day? But the VA committee is a place where you do get a lot of things done. I look back on the Forever GI Bill, the VA Mission Act that was passed. The VA Mission Act was co-sponsored by every member of the committee, and I don't think there's too many times you can say that in any other committee. And that's a big bill. That was a big bill that got a lot done. So I agree. It was always a pleasure to walk into the VA committee room because you know you're going to have good conversation that is very serious and professional in every way as you're taking care of the veterans. So in particular, this particular bill, the Vet Op Act, was very important to me in so many ways for a lot of reasons, because what it does is it focuses on that transition, if you will, to civilian life and the opportunities that exist economically. So let me take you back a little bit. So for 6 years, I served on Armed Services and VA. I'm also a veteran. I served a year in Iraq, 05, 06, as a surgeon there. And when I came back from the war, I hadn't been home for 15 months. And as a reservist, somebody said, you don't have to go back to work for 90 days. And I said, I'm going next week. I'm not going to sit around my house. And I think that's the important factor. And that's easy for me because I had a medical practice to go back to. Not everybody has that luxury. And at the time, I was 47 years old. For some people, they're 21 years old, 22 years old, and haven't had something that's been established over a long period of time. And you start to think about what you go through during that time. It was very, very odd because you come back and the rest of the country's just going about their business. There's gas at the pump, there's food at the store, and no one knows what you just really went through. And if you don't have somewhere to go and something to do, it's very different. There was a book called Faith of the American Soldier. And it was mostly about how troops would get together and pray before their missions and do things like that. But there was one passage in there that caught me, and it was about a soldier who was getting ready to come home. He had been in Iraq for a year, and they're at the Baghdad airport, and he begins to cry. And somebody said, "Why are you crying? We're going home." He said, "Because I don't think we'll ever be able to do as much for other people as we did here. And then I'm going to be bored, and it's going to seem mundane when I get home." And I think that is very true in so many ways. So why is this important? My colleague friend here mentioned the TAP program, Transition Assistance Program. And at one point that was more like, hey, you're getting out, here's your benefits, I just want you to know, what all you deserve after this, and we'll see you later. And to me, it's much more important to go further back. So think about what the VA has had to do. They've had to be reactive to any conditions or problems that you may have. And I think a lot of those come from the fact that you were part of something big. You were part of something where you were needed every day. You were essential. And if you come back and you don't have somewhere to go and somewhere to drive forward, it's very challenging. Post-traumatic stress is very real. If you've been in that environment and see what you see, and that hasn't affected you in some way, shape, or form, then there's probably something wrong with you. But if you've been there and it does have an effect on you to some degree, I consider that normal and should be addressed to the level that you need it. But I think just as important is what I like to term as post-essential stress. You went from being so essential and so needed, and then you may come back and have nothing. So it's important that you have a plan. And so this within the VA is a great opportunity to make sure that we're really focusing on opportunity for veterans, not only when they first get out, but beyond that they continue to have opportunities. That to me is important. So for transition assistance, I want to go back even further. I would love to see more and more that when you get recruited, you're a young man or woman that's thinking about joining the military, and you get with a recruiter, and the recruiter says, well, what do you want to do in the military? I want to be a Marine. I want to be in the Army. I want to do infantry. Okay, well, here's what that path looks like. And imagine the recruiter right then and there saying, and what do you want to do after? Let's talk about that right now, too. And let's prepare that path. Because whether you're going to be in for 4 years or 24 years, let's talk about that. And when you're 2 years out from re-enlistment, maybe you're having a conversation with a professional that's saying, okay, here's your path in the military if you want to stay in, and here's a path otherwise. Are you going to use your GI Bill? Are we going to get you into employment? Are we going to take everything you learned in the military and parlay that into a job? If you graduate college and you get your degree and you don't have a job lined up and you don't know where you're going, that's not that great of a day. But if you take that uniform off and you know where you're going next and what the opportunities are, that's much better. And you look at it. You look at what happens as I talk about the VA being reactive. You know, most of the suicides that we hear so much about, they don't happen in uniform. They happen later. And I think they happen later because of that particular situation, if you have nowhere to go and no one around to understand what you've been through and to wake up every day with a purpose. That makes a difference. And that's what you have when you're in uniform. So I think all of these things are so very, very important as we move forward and try and craft legislation that helps our veterans. You know, in the Army now we say soldier for life. Let's mean it. Let's mean it. Soldier for life, but we're going to be with you, and we're going to help you, and we're going to guide out a path and a career for you. Imagine a parent who's sitting there, who hears a recruiter say, what do you want to do afterwards? We want to get you there too. That's huge. And this bill is a step in that direction. And as was mentioned, the TAP program, that's where we're going. When I was on Armed Services and VA, this is a conversation we started having. And Jody Arrington has picked up that ball and run with it as well, with you, I'm sure, Mike, and I appreciate that so very much because I think it's important. And let's break that stigma that so many have that was mentioned earlier. You know, I was at an event with Major League Baseball owners, and George Bush showed up unexpectedly. And the owners have him get up, and they said, well, what are you doing in town? He said, well, I'm here to work with veterans. I'm here to help the veterans as they're transitioning, help them figure out how to actually put together a resume and apply for a job. He said, I tell them, when they ask you for your qualifications and what your skills are, you can't just put sniper. You got to say, you know, I pay attention to detail. I show up for work on time, and you can count on me. Those are the types of things that we've got to do. And so there's so many people trying to help with this transition. We need to do our job here in Congress to do everything that we can to do that. And you know, I also, in the line of that stigma, I also met a veteran one time who had lost both legs, and he was in a band playing guitar. And I began talking to him, and of course this was at a military event, and he said, you know, I'm not a wounded warrior, I'm still a warrior. And I think that we should take a look at all of those that served, and I think that most don't want your pity, they want you to appreciate what they've done and let you know that they're still in the game. So thank you all very much for being here this morning. I guess we'll begin our conversation. Thank you.
Well, Congressman, thank you both so much for the remarks and for this. I know I'm the last thing standing between you guys and getting back to constituents for summer break here, so I'll try not to be
You in traffic.
try not to be too rough. No, absolutely. Let me build off of what you were just talking about here, not just with the Vet Op Act, but with the overall thought of how benefits are delivered, how programs are delivered in VA. I know you and I were on this stage almost a year ago talking about this same bill, this same idea. Do you feel like VA is getting better at shifting from the idea of delivering benefits as a process to something that's a collaborative effort, something that, you know, this idea of not just we send out the checks, but we're actually working with veterans to personalize that, to figure that part out?
Personally, I do, and I can speak for the 2 VA health centers that we have in my district that I think have really, really taken that approach more and more. You know, it's not just pushing some paper, it's helping another human being and working with human being, and I think that we're seeing that more and more. It's the culture is improving in that regard. And I think that it maybe has always been, but I think as long as I've been in Congress, as far as the VA committee, that's been the feeling.
Yeah, I agree. My 2 VA health centers in my district, one's in La Jolla, one is in Oceanside, and I think the team there is doing a fantastic job. The local veterans that I speak with are getting an extremely high quality of care, looking holistically at the whole person and their needs. I think the challenge that we face in San Diego is that there are too many who are falling through the cracks, who are eligible for services but aren't getting the services, for many reasons that happens. We have an issue, as I'm sure you know, with veteran homelessness. In our area, there's roughly 1,300 or so homeless vets throughout the greater San Diego area. My hope is that in time, with a lot of hard work and with a lot of great people around the community, we can dramatically reduce that number. But too many are falling through the cracks, and you've got a lot of folks with OTH discharges other than honorable discharges that aren't necessarily taking advantage of any services. They're only eligible for certain services. So some of my colleagues, I know Scott Peters, my colleague Scott Peters has a couple of bills that would expand some of the housing services that are eligible, like the VASH voucher program. But we've got to do all we can to make sure people aren't falling through the cracks, that everybody's getting the services they need. We have a huge problem with addiction and opioids, not just in the veteran community, but throughout our population. We have a big problem with homelessness, not just in the veteran community, but throughout our population. Everything that I have seen, the VA, both locally and the folks here, Secretary Wilkie and others that I've spoken with, are doing everything they can to address the problems that exist. But we've just got to stay on it. You know, we can't let up at all. We've got to. I think the Vet Op Act is a great way to focus and target the resources that exist to make sure that they're being used most effectively, cut through red tape, and actually serve the veteran in the best way possible.
Well, that was going to be my next question here. If you're seeing those improvements, if we're seeing veterans unemployment reaching historic lows, do we need to worry about this? Is this just a matter of the system functioning on its own, and maybe these programs are doing fine as a second fiddle?
Well, I think there's two components of it. So what we're trying to do on one front is be preventive. So when you talk about homelessness and how do we get the new veteran, as they're leaving service, to immediately not drift towards homelessness, right? So that's what you're talking about trying to do on the front end. But at the same time, there's a lot of catching up to do with those that have been out there for a while, not knowing where to turn. You know, we always appreciate, and I'm sure you do too, when somebody calls your office, because they're looking for guidance sometimes. But there's also something you said in the community, and that's a big part of it too. It has been so wonderful to see how many private citizens or private groups have popped up to try and be there. In Cincinnati, we have, and it's private, Tri-State Veterans Center. And veterans can show up and get engaged with anything, talk about their benefits, have assistance with maybe something at the hospital, work towards employment. You know, the VA cannot necessarily be a headhunter for everybody, but these centers are. And those are things that we're seeing take place that didn't exist before. And so I think that hopefully the next generation will find themselves in a better position than, say, previous generations.
I would just add, you know, we have a veteran, so I have Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton in my district, right in the heart of my district, and we've got just a huge number of Marines and a ton of folks from the Navy and others that come serve in our great weather, and they want to come back. So our greater San Diego region, according to Secretary Wilkie, within the next decade will have the most veterans of anywhere in the United States. So it's really important to me that we have a veteran on staff dealing with veteran constituent casework. And so what I've learned through that experience of having a great corpsman on our team who has a very active caseload with veteran casework is that everyone is well-intentioned, but sometimes the VA's own bureaucracy can get in its own way. And so the idea here is that you create a fourth administration, you specifically target those resources on things like housing, homelessness, workforce development, transition assistance, and all the rest, and you're better able to have a clearer set of targets, standards, and then implement those. One area that is particularly problematic, the overall rate of veteran homelessness has remained roughly steady, which is not good, but the rate of women veteran homelessness is going up dramatically in certain places. And that is a real challenge, something that we really have to look at. The other thing I'll say is that the amazing work, to echo what Brad said, the amazing work being done by nonprofits should not be a substitute for the core work of the VA. A lot of those nonprofits have sprung up because the VA still has gaps. Great example in our region is the Veterans Stand Down. We have two. We have the main San Diego Stand Down, and we have a North County Stand Down, where those who are on the brink of homelessness or who are homeless come forward to get those wraparound services from a wide variety of organizations. But that's being done because these people are falling through the cracks. They need a nonprofit there. The same with, we have a similar Veterans Center, which is incredible, but still is not a substitute for the core mission of the VA. So we can always do better. People are doing a great job at the VA. People are doing a great job locally and nationally. I think we can always do better, and sometimes the system can get in the way of effectiveness, and that's what I think we're trying to address.
Okay, so you said earlier that you've spoken to Senator Tester. I actually checked with the committee for a different story yesterday. You've passed 24 bills so far this year.
24, all right.
How many do you think you can get through the Senate? Are you optimistic? I mean, we've seen this stall before, not for any reason other than some VA opposition and some institutional locking up. So
I hope that we can get a good number of them that are not as controversial, hotlined or passed through unanimous consent. They obviously have their own process over there, and I know Senator Tester and Johnny Isakson have a really great working relationship. My hope is that this really does get on the radar, because we've already seen that there are things that we can get done. The Blue Water Navy Act being a great example of something that many years in the making, Democrats and Republicans came together, great leadership from Chairman Takano and Ranking Member Rowe, and then the folks in the Senate getting it over the line and signed the law by the President. That's going to be a huge deal for Vietnam veterans who have been out of the loop when it comes to the benefits that they rightfully deserve. Just one example, and I think we're going to have more success stories, and I hope the media will cover it. I hope that the narrative isn't just, oh, it's dysfunctional, nothing happens in Washington, but rather that, well, there are a lot of disagreements. There are also some very big agreements as well, and big things that we're getting done specifically for our veterans and for our military families as well.
all right, great. Listen, we've only got these gentlemen for a few more minutes. I did promise I'd open up some audience questions, so I see one in the back. Just wait for the microphone, and please introduce yourself.
One thing I just want to say real quick, I want to thank the committee staff who are here and my personal staff. You guys are doing a great job. You're working together. Partisanship has nothing to do with it. Just trying to be effective and working for our veterans is what drives them, and I thank them for their work.
Yeah, they do a great job.
My name is Logan Isaac. I'm a disabled veteran, and I have a question about the Vet Op Act. And first of all, I thank both of you congressmen for your service. I appreciate what you're doing in VA and other committee assignments. The Vet Op Act sounds like civil rights by another name. You talked about fair housing, access to quality education, employment, but justice for GIs, for service members and veterans, is often a hodgepodge of poorly enforced and largely unknown federal statutes that need some more attention. I'm thinking especially the Soldiers Amendment under the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009, passed just 10 years ago, as well as VEVRA, which the Department of Labor oversees but resides within Title 38 of the U.S. Code. Before any fourth administration stands up, my question, first, I have two questions. The first goes to you, Congressman Levin, and then the second to both. Before any fourth administration stands up under the Vet Op Act, would you be willing and able to hold a hearing underneath in your committee, the Equal Economic Opportunity Subcommittee under HVAC, to look into how to consolidate and expand and strengthen those civil rights that do exist for soldiers and veterans? And secondly, would either of you or both of you be willing to sign letters, open letters to federal agencies holding them to account for those civil rights laws for soldiers and veterans that they are not enforcing or do not seem to know about?
Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for your service and for asking that. I'd be happy to work with our committee staff and talk about the hearing schedule that we have coming up. I know we have a August field hearing and then I'm sure we'll have plenty more opportunities throughout the session, and I'd be happy to work with you. And somewhere in here is Faith Williams from my personal office. There she is in the back. I don't think Justin is here from HVAC, who kind of helps manage the calendar, but we'd be happy to speak with you about that because I think it's an important concern. And I'm sure that you would love having a hearing on implementation of the Vet Op Act. The second question, I'd be happy to look at that, and if you could circle up with Faith before we go this morning, I'd be happy to follow up.
Yeah, and thanks for your service and thanks for advocacy. I mean, that's the important thing, you know, in the jobs that we sit in. It's a matter of hearing back from people and taking appropriate actions based on what's going on. But part of the idea that the fourth administration, it's not adding more people. It's focusing on an area that has been neglected because of the overwhelming amount of work that goes into some of the other areas in the VBA. And we wanted to bring more attention to this particular area of benefits that are out there for veterans and make sure that they're getting them because we think it's such a high priority. And actually, that's what we're just trying to do, is to prioritize it. So I think that would fall in line with what you're asking and concerned about as far as those rights and benefits.
So are you saying, is this, if we were to have the fourth administration, these are the kind of topics that potentially that new administration could be focusing on, maybe not on the legislative side, but be talking about, hey, here's other ideas, here's other approaches to these topics that just are getting pushed by the wayside by all of the demands on VBA right now?
It would give it greater attention and greater follow-up.
Exactly right.
Okay.
That's the idea.
All right, I think we got time for one more, if there's anyone else. If not, I can cut you guys loose a couple minutes early and let you get back home. So appreciate it. Appreciate
Thank
the
you.
time here.
Yeah, you
Thanks
bet.
so much, and we'll be interested to see when you come back in September if you can push this through. Unless you've heard something that it might sneak through the Senate next week.
I have no idea what the Senate will do, but maybe some in this room are clairvoyant and can tell us. But I do know that Senator Tester is deeply committed, personally committed to a lot of these issues, and I'm sure the same goes for Senator Isaacson. And I think if anything can get done, we're going to get it done.
All right, great. Listen, I'm going to ask everyone to stay seated while the congressmen get out of here and while we reset the stage for our next panel. But I want to give you guys one more round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for all you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we got a lot to process there from what the congressman said, and Rebecca, you and I, as I referenced, have already talked about this on this stage, and unfortunately, you're still talking about it because it hasn't advanced too much. Let me introduce the panel very quickly. I'm going to ask you all to talk about a little bit about the work you're doing, how that connects to this in a moment. But to my side here, I have Rory Riley Topping, founder of Riley Topping Consulting, and former House Veterans Affairs Staff Director. Mike Hutchins, Chief Development Officer at Combined Arms. Cynthia Gilman, Senior Vice President at the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, and Rebecca Burgess with AEI. Rebecca, let me start with you, because when we're talking about this Vet Op Act, when we're talking about looking at benefits differently, we're really talking about a very different way of thinking about what VA delivers, what VA provides to veterans, shifting from that idea of sending checks out and making the checks get on time to a more proactive, a more detailed cooperation with the veteran on some of those economic opportunity goals and some of those transition things and everything. So, look, you've been working on this for a while. Where are we? Are we getting any better? The congressman said they think VA is getting more personalized. VA is starting to step into this role more. Do you agree?
It's trying very hard, right? So it gets an A+ on effort, on kindness efforts, as it always has. But where we're really lacking is in the intelligent kindness aspect of this, which is VA is so structured in a way that it is centered around disability and the idea that a veteran is the recipient of a check. And it's been this way since before 1930. So this week in 1930, Herbert Hoover sat down and said, this is a crazy system. We have all of these disability benefits and things for services for veterans that are being served through various different agencies. Let's bring them all together under one agency where we can get some accountability for this. And guess what? By 1989, when President Reagan made it a cabinet agency, the same discussion was happening about this being too much of an amalgamation of different programs that were being taken care of by different people. And when Senator Glenn, since we're talking about the moon landing this week, helped push that through, the idea was still about how do we get benefits to veterans, how do we have some accountability for it, but no one in that entire almost 100 years ever asked what is the end goal of our care and the services that the federal government gives to veterans. And we're still asking that same question, and I think on that score, VA has not done a good job of thinking through the long term of what is the end goal of what we're trying to do here. Is it simply deliver services to veterans, or is it letting veterans be in the driver's seat of their own successful careers and lives as civilians after this?
Rory, you've done quite a bit of work with the benefits, veterans benefits issues, especially the appeals issues. Where are we with that idea now? Is it just send out the check, deny the check, and not really think about the concept behind why we're reimbursing these veterans, why we're sending this money out?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things that interrelate to what Rebecca just said in terms of, you asked about, you were on this stage a year ago, what kind of progress have we made, where's the cooperation from VA? So I always make the analogy to judicial review for veterans, which we did not have for 200 years. The first Veterans Judicial Review Act was introduced in 1976, and it wasn't passed until when VA became a cabinet department in 1988. So these initiatives, particularly things that involve significant policy shifts, often take more time, I think, than a lot of us would like to see. But back to the point about just giving disability checks, statutorily, our disability compensation laws for veterans are designed to make up for the average impairment in earnings capacity. And when our ratings disability codes were written, most of them were written in 1945. And so we had a very different economy. What impacted your ability to work, an orthopedic disability, for example, had a much greater impact on one's ability to work when we were a largely agrarian economy than it does today. Whereas the inverse is true today. If you have something like a mental health disability or a TBI, that's going to have a much greater impact on your average earnings capacity today. So VA has been working to update a lot of their rating systems. Likewise, that system has, or that process, I should say, has taken a lot longer than I think a lot of people want to see. But you see that interrelation with, ultimately, we want to make veterans whole. And big picture, just giving them a check in and of itself isn't always what's going to make someone whole. We need to emphasize these other programs.
Yeah, it's interesting because you need to update those ratings. You need to make sure that you're reflecting, but are your support programs also reflecting that change as well? If you're saying TBI is more significant in today's economy, are you then looking at what additional services you'll need to get those folks to to the employment they may want or they may need.
Well, and I think you're right. And so I think the issue is, yes, people are looking at them, but they need to do more than just look at them. One of the phrases that we hear a lot is when we have these conversations, people often admire a problem. And instead of just admiring the problem and saying, yeah, we should do more, it's what does, we talk about accountability. What does that look like? It's a great buzzword, but since the VA has been in existence, nobody's really been able to nail down and implement that. So I think we need to come together more around substance as opposed to just looking at these things. It's a start, but it's not enough.
Mike and Cynthia, talk a little bit about what you guys are seeing, what your organizations are doing in this area. So Mike, let's start with you.
Sure. As you mentioned earlier, I'm the Chief Development Officer for Combined Arms, and Combined Arms is a forward-thinking nonprofit that intertwines collaboration and innovation in order to provide access to social services and resources to veterans in a fast and efficient manner. So really, we accomplish that in 4 different ways. The first is we have a co-working, collaborative, shared facility in Houston, Texas, which 56 nonprofit and government agencies all work together to provide services to veterans. And this causes what we call intentional collaborative collisions as they're dealing with veteran intakes. And as veterans are getting connected to services, you can pop over a cubicle and say, hey, I have this person, I can't provide this service, can you guys work with him? So it's very, very quick to do lateral transfers and really get veterans connected quickly. The second thing that we have is an integrated technology system. So we utilize Salesforce, which is the #1 CRM in the world. And utilizing Salesforce allows us to have lateral transfers, and we have a tremendous amount of back-end customization, specifically for the veterans to make sure that we're capturing all the data and all the resources that they need. And then the third thing that we have is upstream marketing. And really what we're trying to do there is work with the bases and the communities all around Texas to ensure that no veteran falls through the cracks, that we can get them before they transition from the service and wrap our arms around them and get them in the Combined Arms system. And then the fourth thing that we do is community engagement. So once veterans transition from the service, they go through the Combined Arms system, and they have employment and they're working and have a great house in the Texas community. The next thing that we do in order to connect them to their community and their tribe again is we have all of these different community levels. So we have affinity groups, and then we have community leaders. And through our affinity groups, we have everything that you can think of. Christian Veterans Network, we have Eagle Scout Veterans Network, Veterans in Energy, Veterans in Technology. Everything that you can think of under the sun, we have a group for it, and these groups hold 300 plus events a year and touch about 3,000 veterans within the Houston community. Altogether, in the past 36 months, we've served 5,000 veterans, and of those 5,000 veterans, we've connected 17,000 resource referral connections. So that means on average, when a veteran is transitioning, they're looking for about 3 different services. And through the Combined Arms methodology, with the 56 member organizations all working together, nonprofit and government agencies, we can fill the gaps and we can connect them to those services. Additionally, Combined Arms requires all of the 56 member organizations to respond to that veteran in 96 hours or less. So the veteran can either physically show up to our location in Houston, or they can do an intake survey on Combined Arms. And 96 hours or less, we require them, we track everything, we hold those organizations accountable to make sure that the veterans get the resources that they need.
Okay. Cynthia, talk a little bit about the foundation.
The Henry M. Jackson Foundation for the Advancement of Military Medicine was authorized by Congress about 36 years ago to serve at the intersection of military and civilian medicine and medical research. While we support about 800-ish research programs globally at any given time, we also look for opportunities to fill gaps that exist. And about 8 years ago, we saw a big gap, and that was that we had many service members leaving active duty service, transitioning home with billions of dollars being spent to assist in that transition experience with absolutely no data to guide us in terms of who needed what services and what services did and didn't actually work. So HAF took that on. We facilitated a public-private research project and worked very closely with the VA and academia and the private sector to launch what is a study that's still ongoing. It's called the Veteran Metrics Initiative Study, or TVMI for short. And it is looking exactly at that question. Who needs services? And of the services that can be provided by both the public, VA, DoD sectors predominantly, and the private sectors, what actually moves the needle? And we have just completed the 6 of our 6 planned waves of data collection. We were able to recruit a very large cohort. We actually reached out to nearly 50,000 men and women from across all services, to include Guard and Reserve, inviting them to participate in this study. Because it was privately funded predominantly, we were able to incentivize folks to stay with us every step of the way. And in fact, we had so many people wanting to come back after wave that we found ourselves having to close our waves down early. And that's kind of an unprecedented problem to have in the longitudinal business. So we have just completed our 3-year look at that transition experience. We are collecting data from the same cohort every 6 months. Of the 50,000 who we invited, about 9,600 participated. And so we are in the process of continuing to look at, examine, speak about, and publish on the findings that we are getting.
And I want to ask you a little bit more about the findings in a minute, but I want to ask both of you, and I'm trying to think of how to phrase this so I don't get myself in trouble. Why do we need your organizations? Aren't these things the VA and the DoD should be doing? Are these guys, I mean, we're 18 years into the current wars. This is not a new problem. We've had veterans coming back. We've had these transition issues. Why are we still seeing these gaps here?
So what I would say is we were absolutely built. Combined Arms was built by veterans. It's run by veterans. Mm-hmm. It was, the idea came over a couple guys drinking a beer one night and saying, there's all these gaps in services.
That's all good ideas too.
Right? There's all these gaps in services. These organizations are not moving fast enough. These veterans need services. Why don't we get everyone to work together? We'll be the backbone organization and we can make this happen. So that's what we did. Where my concerns lie is the flexibility and speed of the organizations to maintain this long term. We have 56 member organizations, so 56 different organizations working together, and we're working all the time. So I have concerns that the VA would be able to handle something. I mean, there's 1.6 million veterans in Texas, 300,000 in Houston. They're coming in and out of our door every day. We're working almost 24/7, and I just have concerns at a larger level and a sustainable level of the ability to provide services to veterans.
Right. And Cynthia, you're partnering with VA on some of this research, so it's not completely like they've ignored this. But why? I mean, why does an outside force have to be pushing VA to do this or to be looking at these things?
So a service member spends time on active duty and is within the DoD system. He or she gets out and is eligible for VA benefits. The one universal truth, though, is people do not go home to federal agencies, they go home to communities. So we wanted to take a look at the transition experience across the board. And I think the DoD does a fantastic job looking within the purview of the DoD. The VA does the same. But we wanted to bring all parties together. And why did somebody else not do it? I don't know. We're just really happy that we were able to and that we got the support that we did across the board to be able to do this work.
One of the things with all of these transition programs and elevating them that comes up, and Rebecca and I, you and I have talked about this a couple of times, it's this idea of trying to balance the narrative of the broken veteran who can't figure this out and comes back and can't find a job with the reality of folks who may need assistance, but aren't a mess, aren't somebody who is on the brink of homelessness and emotional breakdown, and all the sort of stereotypes that you may see out there. So is there, I don't want to say a concern, but how do you balance, elevating these programs, making this information more available with that idea of perpetuating the narrative? Now, Rebecca, why don't you start, because we've talked about this.
So I think you start by thinking that the veteran has a life after service that involves being a fully functional member of society, and that the highest highs that they reached in their military service were nothing compared to maybe the highs that they will reach afterwards, which gives you a very different perspective about how you think about their health. You start thinking about whole health models, and that is what kind of helps you see that they might have particular issues, problems, challenges at the moment, and you have to ask yourself which ones of these are permanent, and which one of these are for a moment that can be healed and that we can move forward. So VA still has no measures in place, no mechanisms in place that ask, require, or even kind of suggest that maybe getting some mental health assistance should be not just premised, but should be with a view towards healing, that maybe you should be seeking improvement. It has no mechanisms in place for that, which then tells you that it's not about improving yourself. It's just about maintenance of you at a particular level. And then you have to ask, what is that particular level? Is it simply receiving a check that tells you that you, in the eyes of this federal agency, are worth X amount of dollars, which is not a way to live. That doesn't give you an identity, that actually gives you the motivation and the purpose towards a successful life, which we know from so much data, not just around veterans, but about societies and individuals, is that sense of identity is the thing that actually motivates you and gives you the purpose to have a fully functional life.
Is that a metric you can get to, though? I mean, obviously, if I'm sending out a check and it arrives and it's cashed, that's easy. That's easy for me to count. How can you? And I guess this is for anyone. How can you quantify that? How can you find a way to say, I've improved my quality of life by 10%. I've been able to transition 30% faster than I would have without this program. Are there ways to get? And I guess Cynthia, maybe with the Veterans Metric Initiative, you can talk to what you've collected and what you've seen so far on that.
So there are three aims of this study. The first is let's track well-being and well-being changes over time within the population. And we looked at 4 domains of well-being. So we looked at their health, which is physical and emotional, their financial, their vocation, which is employment and education, and their social relationships. In order to track that, we developed a well-being instrument that was done by our VA research team up in Boston. Took them about a year, but they did create a well-being instrument that's been validated, and it was applied at each of these 6 waves that we reached out to our folks. And we took a very holistic approach. We wanted to know, so let's take employment. Do you have a job? If you have a job, how are you functioning in your job? Are you excelling, or are you getting in trouble? And how satisfied are you with your job? So in each of our domains, we're tracking that over time. We're also asking the folks to tell us what programs and services they're using to assist them, if any, in the transition experience. And what we then do is look at what are the components of all these thousands of programs that are being reported, and they can be publicly provided programs or private, and we're breaking these programs into their component parts. That's our second aim, so that we can accomplish our third aim, which is to look at what are the components of all of these different programs that are moving the needle on well-being outcomes. So if we want to look at employment, we look at what are the components of employment program, resume writing. What we are finding is that those who do participate in programs where resume writing is a component of the program, that is a very strong predictor of veterans getting jobs in subsequent waves of the survey. So that's the kind of analytical way that we're trying to look at how are folks doing, and we have general findings on that as well.
And
yeah.
How is that data being used right now? Are you're sharing that with VA? Are they acting on it, or is it? A report on a shelf that's collecting dust?
Gosh, I hope not.
Yeah.
There's way too much work that's gone into let the dust collect. But it's a fabulous question, and we appreciate it. So we are facilitating research. HJF is not a think tank organization. We are not lobbyists. Our goal, and part of the reason for being here, and our president and CEO, Dr. Caravallo, is here, is to put this information out there, that the study is underway, that all of the findings are on our website, and we hope that others in the room can take it and run with it in a variety of different ways.
Are you saying I have to write another white paper about this?
You do not have to write one, but you can.
I just wanted to pick up on your reference about studies sitting on the shelf collecting dust, because there is one of those from 2007. If you remember, in the wake of Walter Reed, we did 2 separate studies about disability benefits, and that was an issue that came up. Was in other countries there is more of an emphasis on quality of life. And there was some conversation, so I would encourage everyone to dust off their 2007 commission reports and go back and look at those about how do you account for quality of life. They did a lot of analogies between the Australian government, where that plays a greater factor in how they handle veterans' benefits. And then one of the other things that that commission report brought up was the fact that there's no emphasis on rehabilitation in our current disability system, which transitions into why people are advocating for this 4th administration. And ultimately, you shouldn't just, there are certain disabilities that, I mean, if you're an amputee, your leg is not going to grow back. That is what it is. But, you know, with PTSD, for example, there's a lot of literature that's out there that you can get treatment and overcome a lot of the symptoms that you may experience in the immediate sense, and it becomes manageable and much less disabling. But unfortunately, a lot of times, because we have this culture that we've been discussing about victimhood and disability benefits, that we're not focused on how to get better. It's just once you're labeled as being disabled, you're almost stuck there. And that's one of the things that I think we also need to get away from.
So, I mean, you've seen the inner workings of VA and the inner workings of Congress, giving oversight there. If the 4th administration was stood up in 2008, 2007, do you think that report gets more attention? Do you think that there's the ability to focus on that, or is it just institutional malaise? Is it can we really expect another layer of bureaucracy, even if it's not adding more people, to be thinking in a whole different way here?
So I know this is often one of the criticisms that comes out of commission reports, and that one included, is that people make recommendations that are that recommend lots of substantive change, and the government doesn't love substantive change. So when that happens, people talk about these recommendations, and then oftentimes nothing happens, or we see very small pieces of reform. So had we had this conversation in 2007, 2008, I mean, I remember being on the Hill, we had a follow-up conversation about Dol Shalala in 2012. It had been 5 years, and just looking back at what have we done, what have we not done, and we hadn't done a whole lot. So even if this had been on the table, I don't know that it would have made its way into law. And 2, just to your second point about bureaucracy, I think this gets to Rebecca's earlier point of we've reorganized the VA a lot through the years, and we've had limited success with that too. So, I was having a conversation with a colleague recently about, maybe we have to have a deep dive into, what are these programs? Do they make sense? In the previous panel, the congressman alluded to the fact that, a lot of these programs are just disjointed. And is there political will to do that kind of a deep dive and reorganization? And despite all of the bipartisanship, I don't know that there is ultimately. So,
Mike, you're at the front line of these disjointed programs, disjointed resources. I mean,
Sure.
the veterans who come to you guys, do they have a sense of the scope of what's available, or is there a lot of just basic education work that you have to do to just let folks know, hey, resume writing, resources, benefits, whatever. It's out here.
Yep.
You just don't know about it.
Absolutely, there's a basic education component of it. And I think there's a gap in DoD policy, actually, with the transition. The way that, a person leaves this community, they enter into the service, they go to 3, 5, whatever duty stations over there, time in service, all over the country, sometimes all over the world. They go overseas to Iraq, Afghanistan, and then they come back and they decide to leave the service, and they're going through a transition assistance program, and then basically, for the most part, going back to the communities that they left from. So there's just this major gap in the expectation that they're going to travel, leave these duty stations and then reform kind of these new habits and then immediately adjust to this civilian life. These habits that they've just are muscle memory over the years. And so I think we need to reframe that, and I love the congressman's point of what if the recruiter was like, oh, great to have you, what branch do you want to be in? And then was, what do you want to do after that time in service? That needs to be something that's talked about through the entire time of a service member's career, and they need to be prepared for that transition well in advance. And I also believe it's the point of the communities to welcome those veterans back in with open arms. That community should embrace the veterans, and there should be a lot more community engagement. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do with Combined Arms. And kind of the third thing is we actually are working with the VA right now. So we just trained 15 VA case managers in Houston to start utilizing our system. So the VA, when they get people that they can't provide the resources for, they actually utilize our technology to refer those veterans to us. And we connect them to the other one of the 55 member organizations.
And just jumping back to the question
Sure.
I asked earlier, when folks are taking advantage of these resources, they're using these programs, that idea of the broken veteran, if I have to ask for help, maybe it's the whole thing. I mean, can you describe just what kind of services these are? This is not the full range of disability benefits and $1,000 checks that I need to survive. We're talking about
everything, yeah. So between these 56 member organizations, there's 400 services, 400 resources that we can provide. Education, benefits, housing, employment, employment for male spouses. We help with special immigrant visas for our interpreters and translators to help them come back to the United States. Shelter, really anything you can think of is provided through one of the member organizations. And it covers all types of discharge as well. So the other than honorable discharges, we have organizations out of all the 56, someone can cover down and help you out. And that's what I think is the genius of this collaborative, collaborative impact organizations. And that's something that needs to be happening at a larger scale. If an organization cannot handle it on its own, which it's shown that it cannot, then it should collaborate with other organizations that are more agile, more efficient, and can move faster to provide these services to veterans.
So if there are these community outreach connections, I guess I'm going back, Rebecca, to what you said earlier about giving VA an A for effort, but not as good for results here. Are we asking too much from a bureaucracy to be thinking this way? Should the goal just be to set up that safety net and then find community organizations, find ways to partner and call it a day? Or is it realistic to really ask a behemoth like VA to think differently about this when they still do have the responsibility for getting those GI Bill checks out on time, getting those disability checks out on time?
I think absolutely, because what is the point? It is funded by taxpayer dollars, and at the end of the day, the VA remains our most visible way of thanking veterans and recognizing service. So it's going to automatically kind of set the tone for the narrative of how the public thinks about veterans. And so it has that responsibility, I think, not just to care for physical bodies, but also to care for reputations and for setting up the narrative of who are our veterans, where are they at, what do they need? Because that, I often say that veterans are the permanent ambassadors of national military service. How we treat them, how we talk about them directly influences who is going to think of actually joining on the front end. And so whether that happens within VA, I think that discussion should be happening within VA, but it also should be a concerted effort between legislators and perhaps administrations of stepping back once again and saying, what is it yes, what is it that we're asking them to do? Is it actually possible what we're expecting them to do? If it's not, then what could be the core of that drives how we see this moving forward? And we're at a wonderful moment to do that because, I mean, frankly, the demographics within the veteran population are going to change incredibly rapidly, and that will force a change in how we go about giving those services. And so we should do it now. We should do it on the front end of this rather than our traditional method of just putting Band-Aids on scandals that happened yesterday.
I'm going to open it to the crowd in just a minute, so whoever's got the mics, if you can get those ready. But before we get to that, the congressman said not enough folks are paying attention to this issue, not enough folks are writing this issue. I've got to get him more copies of our paper because we, of course, are writing about this issue. But I do, this has not been the predominant narrative for VA for the last year. It's been healthcare, it's been choice, it's been the Mission Act and everything. So I'm wondering if each of you can talk, and Roy, I'll start with you, just about how, do you feel like there is attention on this, and how do you drive more attention to these sort of issues which affect everything else? If you've got the employment transition issues down better, you are going to see health issues. You are going to see suicide issues become easier to deal with. I shouldn't say easy to deal with, but it's going to have that secondary effect. So how do you refocus there?
So I think you refocus by showing that all of these things are interrelated. So I write a lot about the social determinants of health. We talked about this the last panel that we did. And if you focus on social determinants, which are things like employment, housing, they have an impact on your health outcomes. And if you are happy at home, you have a home, you're employed, you're less likely to have greater impact on your physical health, you're less likely to be suicidal. So I think we need to, rather than just focusing on all of these things in a vacuum, we need to shift that narrative to show that they're all interrelated. And for all of these programs, we always talk about how much they cost. And if we have this focus on returning people to a healthy place, because, again, we have all of these things that fit together, they're employed, they're healthier, then that actually drives down some of our healthcare costs in the long run.
Yeah, but we're really bad at doing that part,
We're
aren't we?
super bad at it, yeah. But we're gonna get better.
Mike, do you feel like, all the work you're doing here, are there days that you walk in and you say, why is no one paying attention to this? Why are we not?
I'll get to that specific part of the question later. But I think the way we need to think about it is we need to reframe it as citizen is the next branch of service at all levels. That's kind of how we need to think about it. So there's some mission and some purpose behind it. And everything you were just talking about is, getting a veteran good employment, good housing. That's the combined arms model is all set up to do that. And that's what we're trying to do is once you connect veterans to social services in a rapid and efficient manner and provide those services, these veterans go on in the community and absolutely thrive. Like, they're all success stories. We have 5,000 success stories from these veterans. And we just need to continue to provide these services, and we need to continue to partner with great organizations out there to amplify this message.
Cynthia?
Veterans are not one size fit all. And one of the clear takeaways that is emerging from this study is that the majority of folks who leave service and transition into civilian life do fine. And what we are also starting to see is that there are folks that we can predict who probably will not do fine. And we are seeing that people present their likely outcome at baseline. And so if we can take the research that's being done, and it is being done by scientists who do write scientific papers, so we have to, but we are also taking these papers and putting them into infographics because we have to make sure that they don't just sit on the shelf. We want the VA, we want the DoD to take this well-being instrument and give it to the transitioning folks during the TAP program, if not before, but at least then, and say, this individual likely is going to be fine. We don't have to worry too much. But this one, and we can sort of tick off what those factors are to be looking for, are going to send up some red flags and start doing interventions targeted to that individual before they leave service and then follow them on. And we hope, we haven't done this part of the study, but we hope to be able to reverse some of those negative outcomes by doing these sorts of targeted interventions.
Rebecca, I know you read plenty of Military Times, so you see plenty of coverage on these issues. But how do you, again, that issue that this is not the number one narrative, this is not the number one legislative priority. How do you? You've been working on this for a couple of years. How do you, short of screaming in senators' faces over the next few months, how are you going to? And I'm not saying that you won't do that, but how do you elevate this issue?
So I think one of the ways is what we're doing right now here. This is something that think tanks can do, is we can elevate conversations, we can give voice to those conversations, and we can make sure that they get to places and communities that don't actually think about these often, right? So the veteran community often talks to itself, and the other part of the work that I do is with civic education. The civic education community is great at talking to itself, and it keeps on wondering why its questions don't get lift from others outside of it. But the things and the issues and the challenges that veterans face are challenges that multiple citizens face. We have questions about skills gap, we have questions about education, we have questions about healthcare. They're at all levels of our society, right? And so sometimes there might be solutions outside of this community, but sometimes the people outside of this community think that this is so special and cordoned off that it can't give anything to it. And so part of what AEI is doing in this space is to try and make sure that people understand that this conversation is a general conversation. It's a public conversation that we all should be a part of, because at the end of the day, veterans are our social assets. They do better, they're healthier, wealthier, happier maybe, in the long term than even their non-military veteran civilian peers, and that should be the story we should be telling. But there is something else I wanted to mention, which is that ever since the GI Bill happened in the 1940s in the wake of World War II, and ever since in the 70s we went to an all-volunteer force, among the top two reasons why people say they want to join the military are either out of patriotic wanting to serve our nation or for education benefits. Our VA side of the equation has never actually acknowledged that aspect. So we're still looking at what are your basket of injuries? Let me tell you then who you are and what you are. It's never said, oh, wow, you want an education from your service. Well, let's talk about how the GI Bill is the key to the door of employment, which is the pathway to your success. And if we could think about it that way, if VA would think about it that way, it could be incentivizing its own self to help veterans in that way.
All right, I've had the panel all to myself for a while. Are there any questions from out here? Yes, sir.
Joel Coopersmith from Georgetown University. I'm the Director of Veterans Initiatives and also a professor of medicine. And I want to, you mentioned the public image of veterans as damaged and that it hurts them. And yet if you look at data, veterans do pretty well. Their employment is good. They do well at the jobs they have. In education, they actually do better than others. So how do you get that image to the public and at the same time not the worry is that if you get too much of that image to the public, people won't be concerned about benefits anymore. So how do you balance those two things and get a better image of veterans in the public, which at present isn't there and really hurts them?
This is a major struggle for me as somebody who writes about VA, writes about veterans. You know, there's a lot of holding VA accountable, wanting to highlight the problems of veterans, but also worrying that you're perpetuating that stereotype. So please tell me how to do my job.
I think this goes to the point that Cynthia made earlier, that veterans are not one size fits all. And, you know, I wrote about this recently as well, in that, you know, I was watching an HVAC hearing where Chairman Takano kept saying, veterans want, and I was like, what veterans are you talking about? Because there's just so many different types of veterans, and I think in the same way that we have a narrative generally that we're not supposed to stereotype people based on other characteristics, we should not stereotype them based on their veteran status either. So, I mean, obviously, I think this is a conversation that we need to continue to have because, like you acknowledged, that balance is really important. And I don't know that we've figured it out yet. You know, I had a conversation with Secretary Principi a couple months ago about being on SVAC at the time of when they were talking about a lot of these Vietnam programs. And, you know, we talked about the wonderful irony of when SVAC was created, it was put in the hands of Alan Cranston, who ran on an anti-war platform. And politically, he wanted to present veterans as victims because he was anti-Vietnam, and that furthered his narrative that war was bad. And so a lot of these programs, at least more recently, stem from that dynamic. So I think as we try to strike that balance, again, we have to not politicize a lot of veterans issues. And I think we also just continually have to acknowledge the diversity, and again, that it just is not a one-size-fits-all.
Is that something that the fourth administration can help with? Is that something that if they're, you know, some of this is just PR, but if they're promoting those success stories, if they're talking about some of those other advantages, some of those other, again, this isn't a broken vet, this is somebody who's looking for help writing a resume because we know all the skills they have. Does that help shift the perception?
I think from a perception standpoint, it potentially does. Another point Rebecca just made is that a lot of people go into service for patriotic duty and for education benefits. And then some of those veterans, I think, are reluctant to seek help from the VA subsequently because they think, oh, well, I'm not disabled and, you know, I don't want people to associate me in that way. But if they had more of a distinct program that they could go to at the VA and identify with, that might be more helpful in having some of these more successful veterans that oftentimes are not driving media narratives have an association with VA, and then also they take that association back to their communities. So when they're talking about their service and their involvement with the VA, they're telling positive stories, not just necessarily stories about how unhappy they are because they couldn't get an appointment.
Mike, talk about how we're doing. Make me squirm over here with the media coverage.
Yeah, sure. So I can speak specifically from a nonprofit standpoint in terms of telling success stories, right? So you have a lot of these nonprofits. There's a lot of these veteran-serving nonprofits out there. There are a lot of ones that are doing great work and have great impact and outcomes. There's a lot that don't as well. They would be extremely concerned. That's the reality of the situation. They would be extremely concerned in telling success stories because there goes their funding. Like the donations would stop, foundations would stop giving, and so that is like a genuine concern for a good portion of the nonprofit industry.
Cynthia, I feel like this is where, when you've got that data, you're going to be able to just hold this up in people's face and say, no, here's what we're seeing. Here's the actual picture of folks who are transitioning successfully but needed this amount of help. Here's what we're seeing with increased quality of life. Is that part of the collection here?
So that's what we ask others to help us do. Come to us and ask to see our findings and help us amplify that message. We have a lot of funders who are supporting this effort, very large corporations, and we've said to them, bring in your communications people, help us get the word out. And it's not happening. And so we're a little concerned about that because now we have real live findings and data that we think can help drive not only the interventions I talked about earlier to help individual veterans as they're getting out, but also if you're a funder and you want to know what program you should be funding because what programs are built on components that are actually working versus not. If you are a veteran wanting to avail himself or herself of a program that is shown to be successful, we want that word to get out as well. We would love the help of the media, and I don't know, are good news stories, is the plane landing on time safely as exciting? I don't know. I would defer to you on that one.
Well, you're going to get my card after this. We have a lot of things to talk about with that. But Rebecca, you want to weigh in on this?
Leo, you're doing a terrible job.
Yeah, I get that a lot.
No, but you actually, so that's an interesting thing. I read Military Times, and I read Task and Purpose, and I read occasionally, that other guy named Ben Kessling at Wall Street Journal.
So let's not give too
you
much
know.
to the competition here. Let's try and...
But if I actually want to know what's going on in veteran land, that's kind of it, right? And then every time, what the public knows is that when there's a waitlist scandal, when there's something around healthcare scandal at the VA, that's the story. That's the only story they know about VA. If you asked kind of your standard, actually well-educated Yale person, what does the VA do? What is the VA made up of? They would not be able to tell you that there are 3 different administrations within it. They don't know that. They think it's a healthcare system. Maybe they know it's a healthcare system, even that, I don't know. And so our media, right, is not well-educated or perhaps interested, actually, in educating themselves about these issues, that they are issues. And I think part of that goes towards coming back to the kindness thing, is that Americans have never, ever not wanted to help veterans, right? So it is an incredibly emotionally fraught area, which makes it difficult to talk about in terms of real policy, because it seems like if you're ever pushing back on something, it sounds like you're taking something away, you're denying the service and the sacrifice of those who have done it. But it is a real policy area. And if we started, those of us in the academic and the science communities and research communities actually started talking about these things as though they are serious policy issues, I think that then helps media and those who are covering the policy issues realize that these are policy issues. They're not simply matters of the heart that we want to put, a dog and a veteran, though we all love puppy dogs, on a web page and say we're good. So I think that's a part of it, and telling all the rest of the stories through how we talk about research, even Cynthia's research talking about new discoveries of transition stress rather than everything being simply PTS and PTSD. Those are types of things.
I had a family member who will go unnamed who a while back was talking to me and said, it just breaks my heart that every one of these vets comes back with PTSD. And I said, that's not the case, and I know you're not reading my stuff now, and now you're in trouble. So.
Can I just add one thing
Sure.
to that? When you talk about serious policy areas, you think about healthcare, and if you look at HHS statistics on Medicaid, it's common knowledge in the Medicaid space that the 10% of sickest patients drive 90% of costs. And I think if we had more conversation about those types of numbers, I don't know the exact numbers at VA, but I'm guessing they're similar. So when we talk about Medicaid policy, it's just a given that this small percent of the population that needs the benefits is driving it. And it also lets people know that there's this other 90% that's out there. So.
Okay. I feel like I've got this half the room my back to. Got a question over here?
Sorry, I'm a professional question asker. Logan Isaac, again, I'm a disabled vet, and it's a similar question, but from a different angle, I think. Leo, you've talked about the broken narrative, and I'm humanities, moral philosophy. So when I hear broken narrative, I think of human dignity. I learned recently that the 105th Congress made suicide a national priority, and often that's kind of what drives headlines is suicide. What didn't get reported in the 105th was this conference in Reno, Nevada on suicide prevention. The primary recommendation of like 80 some odd recommendations had to do with prejudice, bias, discrimination, and they were talking mostly about homophobia and racism, but it does beg the question, the connection between suicide and human dignity within the veteran community. So in 2009, I mentioned the Soldiers Amendment under the Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which protects service members, their family, and veterans up to 5 years after discharge. When that amendment was passed by Jeff Sessions, actually, the congressional intent that was voted on was that the military would be put on equal footing with other protected classes. Then in 2013, the United States Commission on Civil Rights held a hearing here in DC asking a similar question about civil rights for our military members. And 2 commissioners asked that explicit question without knowing the Soldiers Amendment: should we make the military a protected class? And then most recently, and I've been kind of into this because of how it affects me, but I'm really interested in whether or not, and this is my question, do any of you, in general or in particular, see any value in narrating the military community to include veterans? We know they're a vulnerable population. Do you see the value socially, policy-based wise, in narrating them as a kind of protected class, as an issue of social justice and parity?
Well, that's interesting because it's, cuts both ways, right? It's you don't want to be seen as outside of the community, but there are there are a lot of challenges that are there. So how do you balance those two of making sure that veterans are are getting the services they need and getting that protection without, I guess, making them feel like they're removed from the community completely, or some sort of second class, second group that's somehow separate from the folks around them?
So I think from a lawyerly standpoint, protected class is a term of art, and it means that you get a different standard of review when you have an injury that's related to your status in that particular class. So as far as whether veterans and members of the military should be a protected class, I don't know off the top of my head if we have what the research is around whether people are experiencing discrimination on that basis. That's something that I just have not researched specifically, so I don't know off the top of my head. But I think I would caution when we make people members of a protected class, it can be also isolating and furthering of identity politics. And I feel that one of the things that we've talked about as part of this conversation is that being a veteran is just one part of people's identity, and perhaps not how they first and foremost identify themselves. I use my husband when we have these conversations all the time, and people often tell me that he doesn't seem like a veteran, which I'm like, okay, well, what does a veteran seem like to you? But he doesn't introduce
have two heads or breathe fire. Or
right,
anything.
I know, but he doesn't introduce himself and say, "Hi, I'm Richard. I'm a veteran." That's just not how. It's not how you necessarily identify to people first and foremost right off the bat. So, I think, big picture, we're talking about veterans as citizens and trying to bring people more together as opposed to isolating them on certain characteristics. So I think it's a very interesting conversation, but I don't know, just again, based on the limited knowledge that I have on how other areas have become protected classes for purposes of constitutional law, that that's necessarily the direction that we want to go in here.
Mike, let me ask you, when you've got those community groups who are working with you and are working with the veterans, does that aggravate the distance, or does that break down the distance? I mean, does it feel like, do you hear from veterans that they feel like they're a charity case because there's someone, or is it, oh good, you sort of understand and we can explain, and now you'll see me as another human being and not as a handout or
Sure.
something?
The community groups definitely break down the distance, right? Because then our members are all out together in the community continually. And a majority of our members, the same thing is, hi, I'm Mike Hutchings, not like, hi, I'm Mike Hutchings, I'm a veteran, Like it's, hi, I'm Mike Hutchings, heard you guys are, have a technology group, we'd love to partner with you guys. And then they go out and they have drinks and they hold events together. And that's what we're doing is we're trying to promote that assimilation into the community. And so you wouldn't know that, he doesn't seem like a veteran. That's the kind of thing, we want to get away from that stereotype of like what is a veteran, what appears to be a veteran. It's a United States citizen just like the rest of you all. Chose a different career path, and now we're back in the community. Let's hang out. That's what we're trying to kind of promote.
Great. Let me ask you, so where do we go from here? Because Rebecca, we've been talking about this for a while. If the Senate, we're looking at a pretty busy fall. We do have a budget deal now, so maybe that takes some of the attention away. They don't have to worry about top lines and whatnot. But what's the, if this were to become law, we're still talking about some time for implementation, some time for changes. Just what is our timeline for, I guess, forcing that thought change in VA to not just processing the checks, but to the more holistic, let's talk about interacting with people?
So I think that, well, obviously in my ideal, wonderful world, this would pass in this Congress, and it would force or would ask VA, since VA seems reluctant to do this, to work with Congress on how this would be implemented, right? So that VA would feel as though it can invest itself in this new thing, and it would ask VA to really step back and ask itself, how does it help veterans at the end of the day, and what is that help for? And we need to do that sooner rather than later, as I mentioned, because of the demographic change. Also because, well, there's lots of questions about the sustainability of our budget. We're, as you could say, it's a measure of success that we're now getting close to $220 billion for VA budget. But I would just caution that at the turn of the century, 1890, VA benefits took up 40% of the US budget, the entire federal budget, and there was such a backlash that then basically veterans lost everything, and I don't think we want to do that again. And so I think that thinking through right now, how can we do this carefully with considering that what are our obligations to veterans and what are our obligations to the American public, and how you do that is actually something that I'm trying, and many other VSOs and groups are trying to do, which is educate not just Congress but staffers. They're so busy they never stop back and ask, what is VA for at the end of the day?
Do you think that backlash is a real problem though? Because it seems to be still far on the other side, which is if we keep shoveling money into this, we're doing the right thing. We'll keep helping. We'll just keep throwing resources at them. And it seems to that VA budget has grown very steadily over the last 18 years. So
I think at some point people start asking questions and they ask, well, why given that we do have a more robust welfare system? We didn't have this welfare system in the 1890s, right? The welfare system, the social system programs actually were built out of the model of VA care. LBJ, who is a champion to many people in terms of civil rights and in terms of social programs, actually wanted to get rid of all specific VA welfare programs because he said, I want this for everyone. Why should, if we just focus on veterans, that might take my whole program away. And I think that that's not inconceivable, that someone, a president coming down the line, a Congress coming down the line, the American public down the line would stop and ask itself those questions.
As we wrap up here, we've talked a little bit about what we're hoping for Congress. Took a couple shots at the media over here. We've got an audience of some public here VSOs. We've also got the audience behind the camera there. What do they need to be looking at now? If I'm a citizen who's just tuning into this, what do I need to be thinking about when I'm thinking about veterans and what I should be expecting?
So I think,
very small question there.
well, I think it's just reiterating some of the points that we've made is that, veterans come from all walks of life. They don't fit into a one-size-fits-all model in terms of their needs, healthcare, education, employment, disability benefits. It just varies. It's a spectrum as opposed to you fit into this box. So I think people just need to recognize that being a veteran is not a be-all, end-all in terms of who a person is. And I think if we approach veterans as, again, just part of the citizenry, I forget the phrase that Mike used earlier, but
Citizen is a next branch of service.
yes, and I think, that's a great slogan. You should write that down.
It's trademark.
We'll talk about it.
I would say that veterans are assets, not deficits. And the second thing I would just encourage everyone to do is connect with veteran service organizations, with those charities, read this research, and everyone can be more educated in the room. This is research I was unaware of, and the first thing I'm going to do is go back and read that. The more education we have, the better everyone can get on how we reframe the current narrative with our veterans.
Just before we go down the panel, on the veterans or assets idea, is it, there's a lot of support for veterans, a lot of support for the military. Is it an issue of not going past that flag-waving yellow ribbon idea, or is it a matter of folks think that, oh, you served and that's great, but what do we do with you now?
Yeah, there was actually a great article that came out here recently, and it was talking about how a lot of corporate America is hiring veterans and have all these numbers. And a lot of experiences is, the veteran employment rate is up, but the retention rate, like a lot of veterans are leaving within the first year of transition to that corporate job because the corporation was not prepared culture-wise and a variety of other factors to to connect with that veteran. And I think the onus is on both sides, right? It's not just the corporations, it's not just DC, it's not just the nonprofits. The onus is also on the veterans themselves. Like, you have to put in hard work during your transition. You have to research. You have to grow your network. Like, you have to push yourself. And a lot of the times, I think people and veterans themselves have this perception like there's all these like handouts. Like, I can just leave the service, my transition is going to be perfect, I'm going to get a corporate job, and I'm going to be happy. There's work that needs to be done on all fronts.
Okay. Cynthia, besides reading the data, which we're all going to dive into after this, what do you want people to take away here?
So veterans are people too, and they came into military service with their own individual backgrounds. And so I don't know that we can attribute, well, I think we can't attribute everything that a person experiences post-military to whatever happened to them in the military, though there are things that certainly are attributable. Part of what we've just added to the study were adverse childhood events. So people who are reporting adverse childhood events are having different outcomes than others. So I just think it's important, and these are very complicated issues and hard to put in media sound bites. I understand that, and so I wish you luck with that.
All right, Rebecca, I'll let you have the last word here.
Excellent. So Cynthia's research and some slides will be on our website after this event, so feel free to visit AEI.com for that and to access those slides and then go from there into her other research. I think that we start talking about veterans as social assets, and that we encourage that message so that veterans themselves see themselves as people to invest in their own success and that can be invested in for the rest of society. And that in terms of the policy space, that we start talking about these issues, veterans policies issues, as serious issues.
All right, great. Thank you all so much. Thank you to AEI for having this panel. Hopefully, we'll be talking about this bill passing in the next few months here, and we'll be able to do that. But I want to ask for one more round of applause for these folks, and they'll be here to beat up afterwards if you need them. So. All right, thank you.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I am. Thank you for that.